Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou katoa, kua hui hui mai nei, runga i te kaupapa o tēnei wā. Tēnā koutou e aku rangatira, marae kura me whatakura. Ki ngā mati, haere, haere, haere atu rā. Ka mihi te iwi tangata a kaina, kia nai tahu, kia tātou e taunei ka nui taku mihi. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa. So I'm going to share with you some key findings from the research that we undertook with wahine Māori around how they keep safe in unsafe relationships. And just to give you a little bit of whakapapa behind this research project, it really came about, I guess, over the years of being in this space for research, but more so when I was on the Family Violence Death Review Committee for 6 years. And I became increasingly disturbed at the way in which Māori women were being framed. And the way in which they were being framed then set up like a domino effect on how everybody who interacted with them came behind that. It shocked me when some wahine indicated that their partners were going to kill them. That people in services and agencies documented that fact, but nothing was done. So that really started getting me to think around, so if you hit blocks all the way you're going when you want help, what does that really mean? And how do you keep yourself safe in amidst all the kōrero around the framing of Māori women? And I also think, we can go back to all our pūrākau, but even, in 1949, Dr. Eru Pōmari was talking about the importance of mothers and what have you, saying everybody who has the welfare of the people at heart knows that the child of today is the men or woman of tomorrow, and that the foundation for any strong virile race fit to fight in the forefront of the battle of life lies in the care that a mother gives her child after the birth. And I think, as a country, we have increasingly removed some of those supports that what my daughters have now, when they've had their pepe, was much less than what I had accessible in terms of learning to become a mum back then. So I thought I'd run over the key findings. I want to talk a little bit about compliance and silence as safety strategies, the role of the family violence system in the entrapment of Māori women in relationships with violent partners, and a few takeaway messages. But before I start, I really do want to acknowledge our participants who were very generous in what they shared, and I just can't say enough. The study wouldn't be what it is without them. And also, I guess I have to talk about Marsden because it funded it. So, you know what I mean? In a very good way. Very good to be funded. So the question really was, how do they keep safe in these unsafe relationships? And the aim was really to challenge some of the common perceptions that Māori women are passive victims of domestic violence, that they make these bad choices, and think about new ways how they are actively protecting themselves in those relationships. And, I'm not going to go over this for too much, but we know that, we've gone from a status where women rightfully had, mana wahine status, and with colonisation over time, that's been diminished, and in some places, we sit on the margins of society, and we're now at a time where we can start restoring and reclaiming some of those things that helped it. But I don't want to overlook, too, the intergenerational consequences of colonisation. This paper arose out of, some of the research that we've been doing, but also out of mine and Melinda Webber's involvement in the Glen inquiry into child abuse and domestic violence, and being able to get a bit of a deeper insight into how that generational cycle continues. But I guess in the middle are the things around the negative whānau and social responses help drive people staying in these relationships and hide some of the violence and abuse that goes on. So I think, it's really important that, what we're talking about today occurs in such a bigger context, particularly the ongoing impacts of colonisation. So we used a kaupapa Māori approach, drawing on mana wahine theory, and we used pūraku and whakapapa. We used constructivist grounded theory as a structure to help us organise some of the data. But we didn't. I'm going to talk today about the wahine that we interviewed. Also, I just want to note that Karina Coates is here somewhere in the audience, and she undertook for an MPhil, interviewed 11 Māori women around the effects. Oh, there she is. The effects of the media on wahine help seeking. So, and she just graduated a few weeks ago. So, yeah. So yeah. We also interviewed rangatahi wahine about what their understanding of being safe was. We interviewed 8 tāne because when we were starting to do the analysis of the wahine interviews, we felt that we needed to be talking to Māori men who'd been, through violence as well, to try and get a bit of a better understanding of things. And we also interviewed 16 kaumātua and key informants. So, most of them identified solely as Māori ethnically. Most of them were currently violence-free. About a third had some form of gang association. But I think importantly in this, 83% of them still had contact with their partner or ex-partner. Most of them, it was an ex-partner. And I think that's a really important thing to consider, because oftentimes, there's a criticism about you've got to leave, but the reality is that they maintain contact with their ex-partner because of the whakapapa of their children. They made decisions based on maintaining the whakapapa of their children, and to their detriment at times. The men, they all used drug and alcohol, except the one that we interviewed who run Māori men's group. Currently they were all violence-free. Again, a third grew up in gangs, but they didn't all grow up in violence, and the ones that didn't talked about their sexual abuse as children and young men, and the deep-seated anger that they could never name for a very long time, that would boil up quite regularly. So, and as the woman said, they also have these stories to tell. So as we were going through the data, we thought, gosh, there's these patterns occurring across all these interviews. So, excuse me. So about a third had experiences of violence in their immediate whānau growing up. Some, about half, just over half in their wider, and similarly for Tāne growing up. But a third were in multiple violent relationships, and just under a third talked about their use of violence, which was a very good opportunity to try and understand women's use of violence when we have the kōrero that women are just as violent as men. So none of these women entered into their relationships using violence. They only come to use violence when they were protecting their children, they were trying to protect themselves, or as a couple of them said, they reached a FU moment, and they were over it. One talked about going into a subsequent relationship and using that violence with a non-violent partner, and she said it took her a long time to understand that he was never going to hurt her. So, I think, we have to be really mindful of the dominant conversations that happen around this that then just allow people to just brush the Māori woman off. In 75% there was alcohol present, where the woman used drugs and alcohol. It was purely for self-medication rather than, sometimes it was within the context of partying and stuff like that, but often it was around trying to cope with the situation they were in. Just over half, there were drugs present as well. Meth created particularly ugly violence, and particularly when you're looking at the descriptions of what in their stories. So, physical, psychological violence. They talked about psychological violence having the lasting impact. And the big question mark that we had over, so this was us going through all our interviews, collecting this information. These are the sorts of things we would look at going forward if we were doing this again. So we have big questions around the sexual violence that was going on for them, because some of it was very obvious and others it was implied. But for me, the whole issue around traumatic brain injury. So a number of these women talked about repeated blunt trauma to the head. They talked about being strangled to the point of blacking out. And we know that those things on their own impact our brains. And so I think there's some research to be done there, because that the traumatic brain injuries interfere with our ability to make decisions, to stitch a story together. So, when the police say, or the lawyers say they can't stitch together a coherent, accurate report, it's possibly because of the effects of the trauma that they've been in. Half of them had protection orders, but only half of them found them useful. No surprise. But what was a surprise was most of them had some agency or multiple agencies or services in their lives. So, there are people in their lives that weren't necessarily being helpful. So when we were going through, we looked at it, that whole, Western notion, you fall sillily in love with people and, head over heels sort of thing. But we weren't seeing that. And when we started really looking at it and discussing it as a team, we found that aroha and manaakitanga were probably the driving things under it, whether they had been brought up, within a Māori cultural context or whether they hadn't. And the reasons they stayed was that they had hope and saw the potential in their tāne, that they weren't always bad and that the times weren't always bad. They recognised their tāne often had their own story, and they just needed to be compassionate and empathetic and give them the space. They said they needed to heal, but they didn't talk about trying to fix or heal them. They just talked about needing to stay strong for them. But however, over time, with the deteriorating relationship and alcohol and drugs and violence increasing, they got to a point where they needed to make a decision. And so this wahine says, I love him even though he's a dick. You take the good, you weigh it up, you get rid of the bad, and you work on the good. I applied that to my partner, and I think back on it. No one pastoral cared us, no one. So we kind of did it ourselves. What I loved about my ex-partner is there's an internal core of him. One of his values of his heart is still relatively good and healthy. So, it was these sort of comments that wahine made around their partners. So what we found was they had quite sophisticated strategies for keeping safe, but protecting others. So the tamariki were of prime importance, first and foremost, for all the women, but also whānau members, friends, sometimes work colleagues, who their partner may have threatened. So they acted to try and keep them. And they did this by being smart. So things like knowing where everybody is at all times, creating a stranger danger plan. So this was, the kids would go up the road to ring the police to say that there was a stranger that was, doing whatever, because they knew that if they rang the police wouldn't come. So they created this plan. Not drinking around tamariki. I was really surprised the number that talked about monitoring what's going on in parties and then trying to either remove the tamariki or move them into some other part. Not drinking themselves so that they could all, drive or have their faculties around decision making. One had mantras like kids, keys and car, parked car, backed into the driveway so nobody could block her. But if she needed to go, she just grabbed the kids, the keys into the car and would leave. And others would run out into the street. Some of them did like little go bags in their rooms with activities for kids that they could push their kids into a room or outside, so away from some impending violence. They often used themselves as distractions for intervening between the use of violence and whoever they were directing it at. Some of them hid knives at night, and one of them knew that she could outrun her partner, so she used that as a strategy. The other thing was being prepared, never leaving the siblings or tamariki alone, having bags packed and hidden. But for other women, that was seen to be dangerous to do that. Just having these strategies mediating, trying to talk their partner down, giving the illusion that everything is okay, and trying to be a good partner, keeping the house clean and tidy, and keep worries and concerns and frustrations to themselves. So they, hang on. So they prevented violence, by knowing the triggers. So, some of them knew that their partners would be jealous of other men, so they, moderated their behaviours around other men. They had, looked at the relationships of people or tamariki present, so particularly recognising that if their partner wasn't their tamariki's biological parent, that could be a trigger. So trying to, stave those things off. Knowing that if they mouthed off or stood up for themselves, that could inflame things. Drugs and alcohol, they were aware of their partners expressing suicidal thoughts as well. That could be a precursor to violence, and the influence of their mates and gangs on their behaviour. So, one woman that comes to mind, she talked very clearly around her partner having having a whole different behaviour and attitude when it was just them. And so they did this by having courage and being strong and downplaying the violence that was going on for them, in amidst sometimes a deteriorating relationship. And, we talk about coercive control and what have you of partners, but one of the things that we wonder is that coercive control for Māori men is different. That rather than it being quite a pathological way of controlling your partner, it seemed to be more that as their lives started spinning out of control, they tried to control what they could. So, I think that's something that, from an Indigenous perspective, we need to think about, that it is different. So all the while they tried keeping safe while protecting others, preventing violence where they could, all amidst that deteriorating relationship. So they navigated this nexus between simultaneously being safe and unsafe at the same time. And they did that by being quite strong. They had this primal intelligence, that's what we've called it, because for the want of a better way of calling it, but that real gut feeling or gut knowing about their situation and the context that they were in, and being able to sort of try and predict what was going to happen. And this is all within a context of constant threats, surveillance, some control at times, being isolated from their support systems, but sometimes they isolated themselves, particularly if they thought that, like one woman talked about disconnecting herself off social media totally, not going out with her friends anymore in case she was photographed and tagged. And so her whole isolating herself out was around the threats that went to her friends if her partner had seen things. So being unsafe, I'll go start on the positive side. Being safe was around protection and safety first, and tamariki come first and foremost. And I think that's really important. We've just been working with some wahine around the use of an internet safety decision aid, and part of it has values, well, for the want of a better word, thing where they can move a bar across. And they were quite concerned about the fact that tamariki were often relegated as third or fourth, and that did not actually reflect their reality, but more the Western tool that we're trying to use. So, we've got some discussions around that, because it's giving the wrong message. And they have strategies that sometimes are adaptive, but sometimes are a bit maladaptive, but they work anyway. So that's important. So isolation, silence and compliance could be considered maladaptive strategies, but actually it keeps them safe. If I don't talk, if I keep my lips zipped, if I do just what he asks, even if I don't like it, it helps keep us safe. And then the use of violence. So knowing safe people, places and spaces, I think, is really important for these women. But aside from the fact that their partner's using violence and maybe using some coercive control, agencies were unhelpful people, and they had very little or no trust in agencies, and they feared for their safety in life when they engaged with them. And societally, we've got all this stigma and systemic and interpersonal racism that goes on. So becoming entrapped is a really important notion. None of them, when there was no violence in any of their relationships when they set out. Then, in varying speeds or time frames, emotional abuse started creeping in, and psychological abuse, and then physical abuse seemed to be around that pattern. And for some, the physical abuse took a few years, but the psychological abuse had done quite a bit of damage in the meantime. So, it is recognising that it's hard to get out, that violence leaves an imprint in them, so, that doesn't help. But I think the most, I'm not going to say stunning, but the most shocking finding in this study, but probably not surprising either when I speak to you all working in this area, is the role of the system in entrapment. So one of the kaumātua talked about prior to colonisation we had our unseen fences, and our unseen fences were our cultural values and tikanga that were the pou that existed, that served to keep everybody safe and well. But with colonisation we moved out of that sort of communal, not needing fences around us because we knew, what was expected, to having living in houses behind fences. And what was happening in the whānau then went in behind closed doors as well. And I think that's quite a good metaphor to try and understand that, because it gives us some hope that maybe we could, culture has a really important role of restoring some of those values in tikanga, as you all are aware. So what we saw is that when women went to agencies or services, they encountered attitudes that were judgmental, discriminatory and racist. And these served as a deterrent for going back. They didn't really want to go back. The other thing is they found that the services were unhelpful. And so that sort of drives the systemic and social entrapment, and the ongoing colonisation that goes on enables that to continue. along with cultural disconnection and social marginalisation. Interestingly, the women who were brought up with a lot of cultural values and things, at some stage they had an aha moment and started drawing on those things that helped them then decide on a pathway out of it. But the number one fear is that if I put up my hand for help, somebody's going to take my tamariki. And that, sadly, in this country is a reality. So I was involved in a cohort study with Benedicte Roland and Rema Vaiawhai Nathan that looked at all children in New Zealand born in 1998 and followed them through till they turned 18. And they looked for notifications to Child Protection Services, which will be now Oranga Tamariki, substantiation and out-of-house placements. The notifications in general, it was that 1 in 4 of those children born in 1998 in this country would be notified for a child protection concern. When we looked at the ethnicity data, 1 in 2 Māori children are reported for a child protection concern. And that's more than just actually there's a bit of a problem. I mean, there's other stuff like discriminatory and racist ways of managing policies and things that sit in on top of that. So, yes, we possibly do have some whānau that don't have that good a ways of bringing up their children. But I just want to go back to this whole, I'm just sorry if it makes this here, that, if you've lived a few generations in a home that hasn't had good role models or role models to show you other ways of doing things, then you do what you do. You do what you know, and whether that's you don't do it that well, you still do it anyway because that's all you've got in your keti. And one of the tāne that I interviewed, and he said, this was my only tool in my keti. I didn't have anything else. And, it wasn't, they were doing a course for something totally unrelated to family violence, and they went into the ngahere, they started learning around the pūrākau and all the rest of it, and then they talked about, gee, our wahine were pretty up there, weren't they, at one stage? So why do we treat our wahine like we do now? And that started them on a journey of conversation and started looking at what they needed to do and how they were going to start changing things. And they talked about slowly changing the tikanga in their whare, and then looking out for young Māori men who were going to become fathers, and what supports they needed around and what skills they would need. So when we talk about the solutions lie in us, that's a really good example of the solutions lying in us. So, but we play this big blame game in this country, and it's not helpful. And social entrapment, if I get a negative response for you when I sort of try and disclose a little bit to you, then I'm not going to try doing it again. So that social entrapment happens, whether it's, the neighbours or the friends or whoever it is, or your own whānau. So they also drive entrapment. I can send this to you. I just think we just need to think about this. I've been working with this communication design student around how we could get some tools together to educate people in services, but our team just had a bit of a discussion that we actually need to create resources for our Māori providers to use with our whānau. So this is the first iteration that she did, and the last one she presented at Waiora Marae, Te Waka Oranga at the weekend, and it's beautiful, but I didn't have a chance to get a picture of it. But she's used the metaphor of a box, and so there's the box around, and then there's a box inside, and then there's a nice kitty inside to look at the to represent the beauty in wahine. So, and when you take the lid off the box, it falls down, and you can see the phases of entrapment, or the aspects. So, this is to try and work with women, for example, or whānau, to try and understand concepts like this, and not underestimating that fear that their children will be taken. I mean, it's a very real fear. They've got a profound lack of trust with others. And I've had feedback on saying, oh yeah, but they're just mad and angry women. And that really troubled me. So I go back to the data and start peeling this back. They possibly come across like that, but they've got this big shield up when they go to services, expecting to be treated badly. So what made the people who have a positive experience, the difference is the people treated them with kindness, caring, they were empathetic, and they helped solve their reason for going there. So, yeah, I think we have to unpick some of those things and start challenging them. So, basically there's a lack of care and protection, like there's no protection for a woman. So what happens, the woman tries to protect the children, staying in a relationship that she doesn't want, and generally then some agency finds out and they want to protect the children, so they remove the children, but they do nothing to help the woman. And isn't this a really important thing? And that decision to leave with no money, no home, what have you, these women ironically saw staying as a safer option for their tamariki than leaving, where they couldn't guarantee their safety. So, these women come in with different contextual backgrounds. This woman's life was shaped by violence. She said, and she talked about the dread of going to the organisations, and says the simple truth is, I didn't feel vulnerable getting the bash or being scared. I felt totally vulnerable having to go to organisations and ask for help. So this really calls into question that whole vulnerability label that's slapped on everybody. This woman, was in court and was asked if her partner could be, or ex-partner, be bailed down the road, and she just saw just a slight thing with his eyebrow, and she knew that if she didn't agree, that they would suffer even more. And this is another example of a woman who wasn't with her partner, had done all this really good work to try and get her first baby had been taken away. And so this was when she was pregnant, and somebody rolled up and gave her an affidavit for her unborn child. And she just said, honestly, I was down like a dog. I was like kicked in the guts, kicked in the heart, kicked in the head, with the psychological impact. And that impacted her for several days. So I guess what I'm saying is that the system impacts our wahine in very different ways. These are just three that I've picked up. Karina's work, Put Yourself in Our Shoes, really highlights the role the media has in society of promulgating these negative views of our Māori woman. The racial profiling, the constant negative portrayal, the whakamā that they end up feeling when they're already whakamā, setting them as bad parents and partners, and it all impacts on help seeking. And there's a real need for the media to get the story right as well. They've got a role in this, so I'd lump them as part of the system. What we did find, though, was the important role of reconnecting with culture, and also, learning about tikanga and things like that. For some people, that wasn't reconnecting them back to their marae, because that may have been where the abuse did, but definitely strengthening their cultural identity, giving them some tools in their whānau keti was really important, and pūrākau played a big part in that in terms of the messages that they give. So we've heard about that this morning from Leonie. So I guess, we have to start thinking about transforming our thinking and doing, and we've used Te Kore Te Pō Te Ao Marama as a way of doing that, so creating conditions for change to transform futures. And in this way, we're thinking about transforming the conversations about what we know and do, so that we can then start thinking differently to create safe and mana-enhancing practice for people. So we want to move to a Māori reality that's, focuses on the whānau rather than on individuals, where that acknowledges that whānau want to protect their tamariki, that they just want to stop the violence, but need help with that. That the benefit system, the kōrero around that is so bad, and the effects that it has on wahine, it's subsistence. It's, I'm sure there's a number of you in here who've had to live on the benefit. I did when my kids were little, and there wasn't much room for saving and making money off it. But the other thing is they're subjected to interrogation and shaming and struggling to get what's rightfully theirs. And just that their realities are diverse and complex, so one size is not going to fit all. So coming up to the end, I just think that there's some key messaging that we need to get out with things like when they meet you, this is what these women are thinking. The woman that felt vulnerable having to ask for help. They need reassurance that it's okay to be seeking help. So I think thinking around all of these things while these other things sit in their background. So I guess my take-home messages today is that Māori women's priority is to protect their tamariki. They utilise their strengths, intelligence, and are smart. They function using aroha and manaakitanga and whakapapa. I think really understanding that they take the whakapapa of their tamariki important and maintaining that. One woman, lost her babies because she made a decision that when the father got out of jail, him and his mother could meet the baby, but nobody told her that was not in the rules. Asking for help is fraught with risk, and I'd like to say that when these women need help, they need it. However, we need to realise that if they pluck up the courage to dial 111, there's no guarantee that they're going to get a police response or an appropriate police response, because we heard about armed offenders, call-outs and them being treated like they were the perpetrator of the violence. So when they ask for help, they've usually exhausted their strategies for trying to keep them and their tamariki safe. Systemic entrapment is a reality for Māori women, and that's a biggie to unpick, and it occurs across the different agencies. And cultural values and tikanga are a protective po that are critical in their healing journey. So nō reira, kia ora koutou katoa.
Kia ora. Number one. Kia ora tātai. So, kia ora, tēnā koe, Denise. We now are open for questions and answers. So, any pātai?
I was just wanting to know, was there any identification of financial abuse in amongst those wahine that you... Was there any concerns in that space?
They didn't really talk about it, and in fact, they talked about not having money. So I think it's definitely something that's worth exploring further, because we do know that financial abuse is a problem. I think, but having said that, I'm going to say that when they go to get a benefit or some assistance and they're denied it when they should be entitled to it, that is a form of state invoked financial abuse. But unlike more affluent families where money plays a bigger role in their daily life, not to say that money's not a role in our whānau, but it just, I've thought about that a lot, yeah.
Kia ora. Thank you for your kōrero. I was just wanting to ask, because I've been many years in the field in this field, and I just wondered, I have never seen any information that talks about non-Māori men committing the violence, because quite often, in my era, from way back, our Māori women who are now queer, they have suffered all their lives because of who they've been, who their partners have been, and it's not always Māori men. So I just wonder what your thoughts are about that, why there is no statistics, because they're also treated differently. When police come, they usually don't get prison. Yeah. I'm talking about the past. I mean, it might be different today. I haven't noticed any difference in that sense.
I think you raise a really important point, that not all women have Māori partners, that they do have non-Māori partners. They didn't talk about that per se in our study, but as I said before, in hindsight there is some information that we would collect if we were doing the study again, and one would be some details around their partners. Yeah, but definitely not all Māori women have violent Māori partners. They can have a non-violent. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
E pātai atu anō?
Kia ora. It's more of a reflective question, just around the whole. Did you ever once talk to the wahine about the before, because we all work in this place called the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and I just sort of wonder. Is there anything out there, rather than us having, because that's where we sit, nearly 24 hours a day as workers, we sit at the bottom of the cliff to pick up the mess. But there's not very many at the top of the cliff or even away from the cliff where the warning signs start.
Yeah.
So what's your kōrero, what's your whakaaro, what's your thinking on that?
There's a lot of work to be done around prevention strategies for our whānau. The wahine in our study who talked about growing up without violence talked about the cultural values and the tikanga that somewhere along the line got a little bit overlooked, but they certainly had them at some stage in their relationship when things were not good, that they could draw on. So I think, it is about bolstering our whānau up with the knowledge. It's a surprise to a lot of people that we weren't violent before colonisation, within our whānau and hapu. So I think the more we can get out there in information and what have you to strengthen our whānau up, it helps. Will it stop violence totally? Possibly not, but I think it would make a huge big dent in resolving the issue. Yeah, and certainly we're talking to the men, culture was what was the thing that actually helped turn them around. And they, and half of them had spent quite significant time in prison for their violence and involvement in drugs. And they talked about strengthening who they were culturally made a big difference. And that stopping the violence ended up becoming, in relation to drugs and alcohol, giving up drugs and alcohol easier to do. The drugs and alcohol were harder. So I think, we can't underestimate, what He Waka Eke Noa is all about, and the work that has Leone and Ngārope and their team have done before in terms of trauma healing. I think there's two things I believe for a bit, is that we have to put a lot of energy into the front end, to the prevention end, because it's not going to stop overnight. We'll still have to have the ambulance at the bottom of the hill, but we need to gather up more information around that in prevention. Yeah, I think that's important.
Kia ora,
Kia ora.
Denise. Thank you for your presentation today, and yourself, Karina, in terms of your contribution. My question is around the systemic entrapment. We know it occurs, everyone knows it happens. Is there an opportunity to talk to those agencies that actually create these spaces for our whānau? You have the research, and is there an opportunity for them to perhaps look at themselves and see what it is that they can do to address their contribution to the entrapment that is a reality for our whānau?
I've talked to lots of people about this research, lots and lots, in government agencies. And I think it's always a light bulb moment for a lot of people. But it's like, how do we put in the supports to start supporting and affecting change in those departments? The other thing is that in some of those government departments, people move quite a bit. So you just get a group of people up and running, and then they've gone. So, yeah, the system's going to be like really nudging it around the corners, and it's going to take quite a bit. And it can't just all be at the bottom that changes. It has to be at the top, and we're just trying to do some change in my work, not related to this, but it's like I'm advocating our middle management now needs to be, we've had all the conversations, we've got all the strategies for up here, now it's the next layer, because they are the important people that trickle it down. And then also starting at the bottom as well, in terms of how people can do things differently. I think we have to show people how things can be done differently, as ironic as that may seem and frustrating as it is. But we can't just assume that people come and they hear it, so it's all in their heads. But I've seen so many incidences where people haven't taken what's in here and applied it to what's unfolding before them. So I think there's some work that we need to be thinking about, is in how do we translate this knowledge now into practice. Yep.
Thank you.
Kia ora. Oh, can I just, one little bit? Notwithstanding that's not the seed at the top that produces the beautiful kōwhai at the bottom, but I named this presentation this because I think this is about nurturing the seeds of our wahine, of our whānau, of our tamariki, so that they will blossom. Kia ora.